Wow. My guest today is Garrett Ryan from Told in Stone. He also has a book, A Time Travel's Guide to Ancient Rome. And before we start, I wanted to ask what did you do about on your channel and what made you start the channel in the first place?
Oh yeah, well, thanks for having me on the podcast. So I started Told in Stone a couple years ago to promote the website toldstone.com, which is a public history project meant to help people learn more about ancient Greece and Rome. And then I decided to write this book, Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants. And I kind of treated the channel as a way of promoting the book at first, and I kind of grew beyond that into an independent platform for exploring the ancient world. I do a bunch of things on that channel. I explore ancient ruins. I talk about frequently asked questions about the Greeks and Romans, kind of frequent myths or commonly held myths about them, and just generally try to approach the Greeks and Romans from new angles.
And what is a recent book about, which you also had? You also written a few books, and your most recent one, Time Travel's Guide, I believe it's called, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah, that was a video series I did. I mean, it was a time traveler's guide to ancient Rome. And so I did a couple different episodes in this, like, what you would do if you want to get a seat in the Coliseum, for example, or, how to watch a race in the Circus Maximus, or bad neighborhoods in ancient Rome. And it's kind of a fun way to approach, the actual complexity of living in ancient Rome, this colossal city, which feels very modern in a lot of ways. And I think people kind of responded to that approach to the ancient world. I might do a book someday.
Sorry, my mistake.
No worries.
Today we're going to talk about gladiators, and it's probably one of the most misconceptions I would use, for lack of a better word, in ancient history, because most people probably just see the gladiators and they think that's how this works, but it's far beyond that. And what I want to ask you, like I said, what is the biggest misconception? How did we get so misled about the gladiators and the way they actually were?
Right. Well, I guess, our image of the gladiators, of course, is shaped so much by Hollywood, by the movie Gladiator itself, of course, but other movies. Kind of, it defines our image of ancient Rome in a lot of ways. Kind of this idea of this blood-soaked entertainment, with the baying populace watching and cheering as men slash themselves each other to death.
Yeah.
And this, of course, is kind of a sensationalized image of what actually was. It was a very, very bloody business. But we should probably think of more almost like a boxing or mixed martial arts. It was more about the artistry of the fight and about the sheer slaughter. There was slaughter. We'll talk about that a little later, I'm sure. A lot of slaughter. And it was a hideously brutal business. But when it came down to it, what the Romans appreciated about the gladiators was the bravery they showed in the arena and the skill of their fighting. And so we should think of it more as an actual, I think, a sporting event, one with all kinds of moral issues, of course, but one the Romans thought of in a way we think of, say MMA or boxing or any kind of other blood sport.
Is boxing and MMA kind of modern day gladiator fights in a sense?
Yeah, I think they're the most comparable things, certainly. Obviously, very rarely does anyone die, thankfully. Yeah. But it's the same approach. They did. It's not just two guys pummeling each other. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Rocky right? Jeez. It happens, of course. They're just beating the hell out of each other. But ideally, it's about them showing that they're skilled. That they have this. They know how to duck and dodge, how to place their punches. It's the sweet science. Is kind of the old name for boxing.
And how did one become a gladiator in the first place? What did you have to do to become a gladiator?
Be very unlucky, basically. So you were captured in war. You were like Spartacus, famously, a Thracian who was captured and made to fight, in the arena. Or you're a condemned criminal. You're a thief. You're not condemned to death immediately, but you're condemned to the arena. Either because the judge knows someone is trying to throw a gladiator game, or he just wants to, give you a kind of second chance. Or in a few cases, you're a slave who either has committed some fault against his master, has been violent, and is sold into the arena by his master. And even more rarely, you're a free man who has voluntarily gone to the arena from extreme poverty, usually. It seems like the only way out of your debts. And so you sell yourself, basically, into the gladiator school and renounce your freedom, in effect. So a couple ways into it, but most gladiators are slaves, and all are under the absolute authority of the master of their school.
What's the cases like in the the Gladiator, where you were deserter from the Roman army, or was that really a case?
Oh yeah, like in Gladiator.
Yeah.
Well, we don't, at least I don't know of any cases, but it certainly happens. Like soldiers who were discharged dishonorably. If you showed cowardice, for example, in battle, then you were labeled. So you were thrown out of the legions, and you were labeled infamous, disgraced, which means that you couldn't be trusted. You couldn't hold your own end in business transactions and politics. And so men like that, who have been discharged dishonorably, who have been cast out from the legions, may have seen the gladiatorial games as a way out, as a way to kind of regain their honor, or a way to just make ends meet. So I'm sure it happened, but I don't know of any exact examples.
There wasn't anyone who just wanted, I want to be a gladiator when I grow up. It wasn't any cases like this, or did that happen too?
I mean, apparently it did. So for the Romans, that was the ultimate disgrace for a parent. If your son voluntarily decided to go off, it's like running off to join the circus, say, you run off to become a gladiator. It was renouncing your position in society. But some did, or at least if we can trust the satirists like Juvenal, for example, who claim that, well-born youths are running off, to the arena to, become these performers. So, I mean, there was an allure to the arena, this idea that, they're all of Rome was watching, and they're performing, their manhood and their courage in front of all these people. But for any Roman with with a good sense, it seemed like a very risky strategy at best, and something to be avoided if at all possible.
Wouldn't it be a good way to show like you said, your manhood? That I'm a man. Look at me. I know how to fight. I can beat this guy. I'm the alpha in this case. Wouldn't that be a good way, in a sense?
I mean, so the better way to do that, to show your courage, would be to join the military, for example. That was the accepted way, become a soldier. Or if you're an aristocrat, to kind of join the ranks of the junior officers, and perform well there. Or even to join the slightly less disgraceful chariot scene, become a driver in the Circus Maximus, for example. Most of them are also slaves or men of low repute, but they're not disgraced like gladiators.
What was the difference there between the Circus Maximus and the gladiators?
Well, I guess that the idea that the gladiators that they sold themselves into the mastery of their master of the school. They sold themselves into slavery, basically. That kind of self-abnegation, kind of making yourself disgraced in the Roman eyes, was a whole different thing. If you were a driver in the Circus Maximus, you were part of these things, the factions, as you're also under the authority of the guy running the faction. But you didn't sell yourself. You didn't give anyone the right, excuse me, to punish you corporally, for example, to beat you, to do whatever they wanted to you. And that's what you did if you made yourself a gladiator. So for the Romans, it felt like kind of surrendering your identity as a Roman, as a free man, if you were free when you began when you sold yourself into the gladiator school, and then kind of renouncing yourself to become a gladiator in this way.
Was it a good life to be a gladiator better than slavery, or was it?
Well, I mean, obviously slavery in the Roman world, there's a huge range of outcomes. If you're working in the mines, for example, where you're breathing dust all day, you're chained in darkness, that's a hideous life. And, for maybe being a gladiator is better than that. But for most Roman slaves, if you're working on an estate, for example, or in one of the elite houses, at least you have a good chance of living to old age, or at least as old as the Romans got. If you're in the gladiatorial school, there's an excellent chance that you're going to die in the arena. And everyone knows that. So, there is this chance, to achieve freedom and glory through, your service in the arena. There's also the much better chance you'll end up dying, on the sand of the Coliseum.
And we talked about being a free man, wanting to be a gladiator, that it was shameful. But if you were a slave, was that what you wanted to do? But did you want to be a gladiator if you were a slave? Like you said, you had no other options really when you were a slave. But if you could, would that be a good thing in a sense?
I mean, it could have been, obviously, so some slaves, if you were, let's say you had an abusive master or something, you were afraid of, being, killed or crippled before you could have a chance to win your own freedom. Then maybe that was the way out. And there may have been slaves who convinced their masters to sell them into the arena. It was probably rare because every slave, at least those in Rome in the big houses there, hope to gain freedom on their own terms by buying their freedom or getting it in the master's will. There are other ways out of slavery, at least for some, for the more elite slaves. But there may have been some who saw who saw service in the arena as a means of escape. We don't have any At least I don't know of any specific examples, but it's likely it happened because it was a way out if you were lucky and good.
And before Coliseum, what was the training like to become a gladiator? What was gladiators do like? How did they treat you there?
It was very rigorous, as you'd expect. So when you first come into the school, you're a tiro, you're a newcomer, a noob, basically. And the idea is that you're going to have to prove yourself to the master of the school, the Lanista, and show your prowess as a gladiator. So they start you off against literally just a big wooden stake, a palus, and you kind of demonstrate you work with an extra heavy training sword. It's twice the weight of a normal sword, and you kind of hack away at this stake, kind of doing basic sword maneuvers, basic sword play, and your form there and kind of your body type, whether you're a heavy person, a light person, you're fast, you're slow, that determines the kind of fighting school, the fighting style you're assigned to. Every gladiator is assigned to a certain fighting type, whether it's like, the netman, the retiarius, the secutor, the pursuer. And the master of the school will decide which fighting type you're best suited for. There are some gladiators who are good at several types, who are expert in different fighting styles. At most choose just one early on, or they're assigned to one. And from that point onward, once you're assigned to a certain armor and a certain fighting type, you train the moves, the set defensive and offensive maneuvers of being, say, a secutor, a retiarius, or whatever, for the entire day, basically. And all of their weapons are extra heavy, so that they're meant to build up a lot of muscle, to be very powerful men. And they're fed very well. They're not very, actually, I had a video about this a couple weeks ago. They're given kind of this gruel made out of barley and mashed up beans. It doesn't taste very good, but it's nutritious and it's cheap, and they're given huge amounts of it. And this kind of keeps them well fed, keeps them going because they're burning off huge amounts of calories every day. They eventually graduate to doing sparring matches against often retired gladiators or expert gladiators in the same school. And after a few months, they're probably ready for their first match in the arena.
And so I was actually speaking a few years ago now with a friend of mine. We talked about this subject, Gladiator, and he said that they were more fat than actually ripped like Russell Crowe and the other guys in the Gladiator. It was not the case that they were more fat and not really ripped as we see in the movies.
Well, they probably weren't toned like modern athletes are. That's just really a modern thing in general.
Yeah.
But they probably weren't fat either. At least most of them probably weren't. Because they were being fed a fattening diet. And this is something that, so about 15 years ago, the Austrians digging at Ephesus dug up a gladiator cemetery and found from analysis of the bones that they had had almost a totally vegetarian diet made up of this gruel, again, this kind of barley and bean gruel. And they pointed out, the forensic anthropologists, that this would have made the men fat. They would have tended to gain weight under this diet. But what they didn't mention is that these guys are also working out every day, all day. So they're also burning off huge amounts of calories all the time. And if you're running a gladiator school, you don't want guys who are sluggish anyway. So, they probably aren't, toned. They probably aren't like, ripped to the gills, veins bulging out everywhere. But it's probably rare to find one who's actually really out of shape. We see on mosaics, for example, with gladiators, or at least what their idealized image of a gladiator is. And they're almost always, very muscular. And actually, even ancient sources will emphasize how over-muscled gladiators are. They don't really call them fat ever. So I think it's kind of in between, that they weren't necessarily, without an ounce of fat on them, but they were probably almost all in quite good shape, able to do a lot of aerobic exercise.
And there is, of course, so much more arenas than just Coliseum. And we're going to talk about Rome and gladiators before Coliseum in a bit. But did they travel like tours around ancient Rome, like to, let's say, Carthage to where there is an amphitheater in Pompeii, and did they travel on tours to fight several battles, or did they just stay in one place?
Yes, there were traveling troops of gladiators. Often they were kind of the lower end gladiators, and they would do kind of like almost like mock fights in like little towns, little market towns. Bigger cities like Rome had their own troops of gladiators who probably stayed mostly in and around Rome because there was enough demand to keep them busy. There wasn't a ton of games every year, probably only about a dozen days a year of gladiatorial games in Rome, at least the big ones. but that was enough to keep Rome's schools occupied. So there probably was in every big city, kind of their gladiators. And then in smaller places, the main regional capital would have a school that might give exhibitions in the smaller towns around. And alongside them, kind of these kind of low-end traveling troops of gladiators who do these mock fights in little towns. So some do travel, certainly. But the ones in Rome, in the center of the empire, probably stay in and around the capital.
What about in the smaller cities like Pompeii and Carthage, that where it wasn't as big arenas, I imagine, that just minor. And I was watching a documentary a month ago, I think, where they said that there might have been a gladiator arena in in Pompeii, where that was barracks and not what I don't remember the original intention, but it might actually have been barracks. But did they travel around, or did they stay in one place as well?
Yeah, well, that's a good example. We have, of course, the arena at Pompeii, the amphitheater, which had quite a few seats for the size of the town. It was a large amphitheater, almost 20,000 people. And there was beside, not far from it, actually right by the theater, kind of on the other side of town, there appeared to be a permanent gladiator barracks there. They found a bunch of gladiator dress equipment, kind of the armor they would wear in the procession before the games, and also other equipment. Actually, I happened to be in Naples a few weeks ago, and I saw they had on display in the Naples Museum there. They had all the stuff from Pompeii. It was a lot of fun to see that in person. But anyway, so the Pompeii Gladiators, there probably was a troupe based there, it would seem. There weren't a ton of shows. We have advertisements for the shows in Pompeii, pasted up on the walls, or they're frescoed on the walls, like there will be shades, and there probably were gladiators coming in from out of town. So they mentioned by name gladiators coming in who are famous. But I would guess there was also a stable of local men who were only in Campania, there in Pompeii, maybe Herculaneum. They kind of go around the local area, but we're centered in Pompeii, which is big enough to have its own little stable. And then the gladiators from Naples, and then a few superstars from Rome coming in now and again for the big games. If you're running a game, if you're the editor of the games, the guy who's paying for the games, it's your responsibility to contract the gladiators with the masters of the schools. So if you can afford, if you're a guy in Pompeii, you can afford to bring in superstars from Rome, you'll do that because it'll bring in the crowds and make you look very good in the eyes of the crowd or in the eyes of the people of Pompeii. But probably most guys who are in the provinces don't have that kind of resources, and they'll skip for the cheaper local fighters if they can.
Was it a good business to run a gladiator school, or did it take most? Well, wasn't it good enough, valuable enough to? Did you lose economic wise? What was it like to run a gladiator school?
Well, from what we know, and there's kind of limited documentation, it could be a pretty lucrative business. You can make a lot of money doing this. So gladiators, the key was you had to hire them out at a good price and not have too many die in the process. Because if a gladiator died, you would, the manager of the games had to pay his full price to you. It actually might work out well if you were the Lanista. Sorry, to back up a little bit. So if you were the Lanista, if you're the manager of the gladiator school, and you were hiring out gladiators, what you do is you kind of rent them out for the games, usually for about 10% of their estimated value. So for a top-end fighter, that might be thousands of sesterces, a working man's annual wage just for one single day's fighting. If I rent out, let's say, an average of maybe 20 gladiators at a time, and so if you keep enough of your fighters alive, that could be a pretty good day for you. You don't lose much of your investment, and you make a pretty good profit by renting them out. But if too many of them die during the games, you have to retrain a whole new crowd of gladiators who aren't famous and aren't well-known and won't rent for a good price. And so the idea is to keep as many alive as possible, unless you're trying to clear house or something, and to rent them out to editors of games, givers of games, who aren't trying to stage a bloodbath or anything.
How often did we talked about it, but how much did mock battles of, like, let's say the Battle of Cannae happen, or that sort of battles? How often did this happen? Was it or was it just one versus one?
So for the stars of the arena, it was always 1v1 because people wanted to see the sword play and the expertise of the great gladiators on display there. But if you just had a bunch of prisoners of war and wanted to kind of put on a grand display, then you do things like that. You stage a battle. So right, like in Gladiator, right, they have like the Battle of Zama or whatever. They stage that. And there are examples like that. So like the Emperor Claudius, for example, who just conquered Britain, brought in a whole bunch of British captives, hundreds of them. and staged the capture of a British town right there in the arena. So they built a little stockade manned with other prisoners of war. And they had these people who were acting like Romans trying to attack this stockade. And so, hundreds died. And it's a great spectacle for the crowd. But if you're anyone but the emperor, you can't really afford to do things like this.
Yeah.
So, Caesar stages a grand battle at one point that involves elephants even. They have a couple captured war elephants involved. And some emperors do similar things where they have like a naumachia, a naval battle, or a full-scale land battle, either in the Circus Maximus or one of the arenas with prisoners of war. But typically gladiators, unless they're the very lowest end gladiators, they're called gregarii, group fighters, are individual fighters, because the whole point of their artistry is to show that they're great one-on-one, thrusting and parrying.
Did people take bets on these gladiators? I think Garrett is gonna win this battle, and not, let's say, the other guy. Mm-hmm. I believe that you were gonna win. Was this allowed, gambling, like we do on football games and today?
Well, gambling is strongly discouraged in Rome. Actually, it's technically illegal, but everyone does it anyway. There's betting all over the place, and there's very strong partisanship, team spirit for these gladiators. There are people who root for a single gladiator, who watch his whole career, and cheer for him. There are people who cheer for types of gladiators. It's like there's the light armored types and the heavy armored types. And they're actually clubs, like almost like a modern sporting club, of people who cheer for the heavy gladiators or the light gladiators. And so it gets very heated. People, are shouting at the fighters as they're, going along, get him there, or stay down or whatever else. And of course, it comes to a crescendo after a man falls, and he pleads for his life. But yeah, there's very strong partisanship and almost certainly an enormous amount of betting. We know what happened in the Circus Maximus, and it definitely happened in the Coliseum too. They had to be kind of a little bit covert because the emperors discouraged rampant gambling because it seemed to be kind of a socially destabilizing thing.
Let's say if I owned you as a gladiator, could I take bets myself? Or was that too risky?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, if you're really bold, right, you bet against yourself or something.
If I owed you, could I, the owner, take bets on that you would win the battle? Mm-hmm. Or was that too risky?
I mean, I don't know. It probably happened. I'm sure it happened. Again, like so much of what gladiators did, it was seen to be low class. And so our Roman authors don't talk about it in any detail, which is very frustrating to people who are interested in it now. That sort of thing definitely happened, but we just don't have any record of it. Because our historians are concerned with, high politics and wars and don't really care about the goings on in the arena.
Let's talk a little bit about Rome before Coliseum. What was the gladiator arena like then?
Mm-hmm. So it took Rome a very long time to have a permanent arena, surprisingly long. So there was an arena before the Coliseum. Actually, there were a couple arenas. There was a small amphitheater built by a guy called Statilius Taurus, kind of off by the Campus Martius. And Nero built a spectacular wooden amphitheater in the same area, which had it had gilded panels. It had amber from the Baltic woven into the arena nets. He actually scattered malachite, that like green stone, into the sands to make it more, sparkle. And so it was a very elaborate construction, but it burned in the Great Fire of 64 and had to be replaced by the Coliseum. And also there were fights staged in the Roman Forum itself, which was a pretty big open area before it was totally enclosed by the emperors.
Do you think we would have the Coliseum if Nero's amphitheater hadn't burned down?
Probably not, because it was built inside of his Golden House, which was, of course, this huge villa in the middle of the city. And it was probably to erase the memory of Nero's Golden House that Vespasian built the Coliseum where he did. I mean, there probably would have been a permanent arena, I think, eventually in Rome, but it might not have been the same scale and definitely would not have been the same place as the Coliseum was eventually.
And of course, we know that the ancient Rome loved their exotic animals, and they transferred from Africa and Asia and wherever they could find exotic animals. How often were they used in battles? Was this a common thing, or was it just rare occasions?
Well, they were very, very expensive. Actually, I talk about this in my book and in one of my videos about how they captured animals for the Coliseum. So it meant starting hunting.
I've seen that one actually.
Oh, yeah. And it meant starting often a year in advance or more of the games. Because, unless you were just studying for local animals, like bulls, for example, from Italy, or bears or boars, which are kind of the three Bs. Those are kind of the easiest animals to get. But if you want to really impress the crowds, if you're an emperor, you want something exotic. And that means going above all to North Africa, where they find elephants, lions, leopards. And the really exotic animals come from sub-Saharan Africa. So things like a hippo or something. Well, hippos are not quite so sub-Saharan, but rhinoceroses, giraffes, animals of the Serengeti, rhinos. And so these animals are hugely impressive when they show up, as are tigers, which have come from either India or what's now northern Iran. And so the more exotic the animal, the more the crowd is liable to be impressed. And often, the really exotic animals, like giraffes, are so rare they'll actually be not even killed in the arena. They'll just be displayed. They'll kind of trot them around the arena a few times for people to gawk at them. There's actually kind of a primitive zoo in one corner of the city where emperors keep the animals before they're showed in the games. People can come see them and kind of ooh and ah. But yeah, so it's a very expensive process and one that requires a huge amount of cooperation from both local hunters and detachments of Roman soldiers in these areas. They're often kind of made to hunt for lions or bears, and they're shipped down in these big wooden crates, either by ship or on wagons into the city in advance of the games.
Was it often that exotic animals like tigers or elephant would kill the gladiators, or were they carefully trying to make sure that the gladiator killed the animal?
Well, I mean, obviously, one, there'd be an element of danger to make it exciting for the crowd. And the beast hunters, the bestiarii, had their own school, and they were very highly trained. So here are guys who could actually, who would punch a bear in the face, just like without even holding a sword, or somebody who could strangle a lion with his bare hands, or like people who almost act like a toreador, like leap over a bull, when it's coming at them. So it probably, most of these guys, they have good weapons, they're highly trained, they probably almost always win. Not only because the animals are often kind of underfed and just very disoriented. Actually, animals like lions, for example, have to be trained often to attack people. They're naturally afraid of people, many of these predators. And so they find the most aggressive ones. And they kind of train them to attack for a couple of months before they're brought into the arena. So they're often, very aggressive, but again, often underfed, disoriented, just not really know what's going on. So the gladiators have a real advantage over the animal. We hear about, like the poet Martial wrote a book of poems about one of the great games held under Domitian, which he mentions, someone, a lion tamer, kind of this guy who tricks with lions, got his hand almost bitten off by a lion. So things obviously happened, but probably a gladiator coming against animals had a pretty good chance of winning almost every engagement.
Was it often that an emperor would give, as we see in the Gladiator again, which is a reference in these episodes, but was it often that he would give the tombstone, and was that a thing at all? If you wanted to see a gladiator die?
Like the plea for mercy and all that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so typically...
or is that just another misconception that we have?
Well, so the emperor is the guy with the decision. So he's the guy who's giving the games, the most spectacular games anyway in Rome. So it is his decision. So usually the crowd will want to spare someone who's fought well. Someone who's fought bravely and is not mortally wounded. Almost always they respect that, the sportsmanship, almost the courage shown. And they'll ask for him to be spared. And it's usually a good idea if you're an emperor to heed the crowd, show that you're enjoying the games with them, that you're listening to them. And it's only a few kind of bloodthirsty emperors who are known for killing a lot of gladiators. Just some emperors, even those who we would think be bloodthirsty, like Nero, for example, try to discourage all deaths in the arena that they show in their games. Probably because it saves them money. They have to pay full price for someone who dies in the arena. And probably because it allows them to show their clemency. If they spare everybody, it shows that they're a merciful person. That kind of plays well to the crowd. So yeah, usually it is a matter of, displaying your clemency to the people who are in the arena.
So Rome is, sorry, not Rome, but Coliseum is built in 69 AD. Nice. And it does take 9 years to, I believe, to finish it. What is the people's reaction to the Coliseum when they see it being built and afterwards when it's finished?
Yeah, it's built astonishingly quickly. We don't know how long exactly, but certainly less than 10 years, and maybe as little, rightly, as 6 or 7. Which, considering the size of the building, is incredible. Modern stadiums take almost that long. And the people are, as you'd expect, very, very impressed. There's even a poem. It's not about the Coliseum, it's about Nero's amphitheater, which is even smaller, about a country guy going into Rome for the first time and seeing the amphitheater. It's kind of his jaw dropping, basically, and trying to describe it to his fellow shepherds when he comes back home. So it was, and actually Marshall's poems I mentioned before about the early games in the Coliseum also talk about how the Coliseum is more impressive than anything the Greeks ever did. It's just this gargantuan monument to the emperor's glory.
What do we have an idea of the cost of this thing compared to today and Rome?
I mean, it's really hard to say. It would be something that would cost, hundreds and hundreds of millions of, dollars or euro, to build now. It was involved digging these colossal concrete foundations, down 50 feet into the clay. They had to import hundreds of thousands of yards of travertine from what's now Tivoli, about 20 miles away. The labor costs alone, and this of course was done without mechanization, just with little, treadmill cranes.
Yeah.
And so it was probably the most expensive single building ever built in the city of Rome, with the possible exception of maybe the Imperial Palace, or I don't know, the Pantheon, I guess, be the close rival. But it's the biggest, the tallest, and probably the costliest building ever built in the city to that point. It's a big deal.
Yeah, I was in Italy, Rome, a few years ago now, and I came in the evening and just going up from the metro station, the Coliseum was the first thing that I saw in the city, and it was just like, wow, it really was mind blowing. I liked it. To see it in person. It is a must see in your lifetime. Absolutely. Now, I was, like I said, I was in Coliseum a few years ago, and when I was listening to this guided photos, they said that they talked about the seatings there, and what was the seating like? In how did you rank, like, if you wanted to sit lowest from the high? What was the best? Of course, the emperor's seat would be the best, but what would be what would be for a commoner? What would be the best seat to sit in Coliseum?
So the closer to the arena, the better. You want to be close to the action. There's this big net, so you don't have to worry about tigers leaping up and grabbing you or anything. So there were 5 sections in the Coliseum. The lowest part, the first section for all of the most important people in Rome, is called the Podium. And it consists of kind of, the others above it are real seats, kind of these stone benches. But the Podium is kind of this series of low platforms. People bring their own chairs, much more comfortable chairs than those stone benches, and set them up along these, tiers of these concrete tiers. This is for the emperor himself. It was a big box right in the middle, along of one of the longer ends of the Coliseum. The Vestal Virgins also have a special place. There's a section for statues of the gods, to show the gods themselves are watching these spectacles. And for the senators and their families, are able to bring a couple distinguished guests and their own, their wives and children. So, if you're one of the most important people in Rome, you get to sit in one of those first few rows. Above them is the first kind of ordinary section of seating. And this is for the equestrian order. So again, these are a little bit wider than the seats above them. They're a little bit nicer. But they're still marble. They're still pretty hard to sit on for an entire day. And then as you get higher, it's the Maenianum, it's called, is the main section. The seats get narrower, much more narrower, more tightly packed. This is kind of the mass seating. This is divided into many sections for different guilds, for example, different associations. And finally, the very worst seats are at the top. This is the Bleacher Seats. These are underneath, right at the very top, the attic of the Coliseum, it's called. And they're made of wood, almost certainly. And they're so narrow, you have to actually stand the entire time watching the games. You can't even sit down. And so, for those people standing up on those wooden benches, it's a very different experience than for the senators down there on those big platforms with their own comfy seats and, sun hats and everything.
Yeah. Do we have an idea of the pricing for the seats?
Well, they're all free, actually, because the emperor is giving the games. And for it's a gift from the emperor to the people. And so the hard part's not being able to buy a ticket. The hard part is finding a ticket, because there's much more demand than there is supply.
How did they give out the tickets when the emperor announced that it would be a game?
So the tickets are these tokens, sort of. They're called tesserae. There's a couple of different shapes. Some were made of like pottery, like pottery fragments, or they were like these lead tokens. And they were distributed by the emperor and his administration to different groups in advance of the game. So he'd hand them out to senators, for example, who would get kind of their own tickets and those for their clients. He'd hand them out to big organizations, to priesthoods, hand them out to kind of what we would call power brokers. And these guys, these intermediaries, these middlemen, would then hand out those tickets to people who would pay them or who they knew and liked. So there was sort of a big, what we would call like a secondary market. So they were free officially, but often you had to pay to get one of those tickets from someone who the emperor had given those tokens to distribute. So it's sort of a messy process where it kind of depended on who you knew and what you're willing to pay that person to kind of get your chance to see the games.
How like you said, it was difficult to get, but for a commoner, how easy was it for a commoner to get one ticket? Did they go out and give them in the streets, or did they have to come to the Senate themselves?
Well, if you were an ordinary Roman, you probably had to see your patron, kind of the rich or powerful person, who you knew and to whom you were a client, kind of your the guy who did favors for you and you did favors for. And this guy would be your chance to get a token from someone more powerful than he was. Or if you're part of an association, a collegia, if you were a tradesman, for example, and what would be kind of a proto-guild, sometimes those associations have access to tickets, almost like a trade union. So kind of, it really came down to knowing somebody with access to the imperial court's distribution system. And it wasn't easy because there's only in an average year, probably about a dozen big games a year, held the entire time. Probably had 12 days of games.
Yeah.
Sometimes an emperor celebrating like a big triumph, there's many more than that, but typically it's very uncommon. And they're really focused a few times in the year. So there's a lot of demand, and probably, like I said, much more demand than supply.
And I believe, if I'm not wrong, that certain senators was assigned to this task to be able to host a game, and that they had to pay from their pockets. Is that the case?
So there's the big imperially sponsored games, the huge ones that everyone wants to see. And then certain city officials do their own games, which are kind of on a smaller scale. They can't outshine the emperor, even if they could afford it, which of course they can't. And later on in the empire, it became more and more prominent for important senators to hold the big games. Above all, the prefect of the city, kind of the mayor of Rome, he's responsible for putting on the big games in like the 5th century, for example. And so we have, some of these people, we have letters from them complaining about them trying to get, say, crocodiles, for example, for their games. We have to learn a little more about the nitty gritty of how the details worked of running these things. But yes, the senators would be involved. But in the High Empire, at the height of the Roman Empire, the big games were run by the emperors only.
And I believe that I was watching somewhere that when we found in the early, I don't remember when, but that we didn't really exactly know what the Coliseum was for. That it was used for gladiator games. Is this the case?
Yeah, I actually have another video. I have a lot of Coliseum videos. I'm realizing
it might have been that one I've seen. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. And so I have one about the Coliseum in the Middle Ages. And believe it or not, they actually forgot that it was used for the gladiatorial games because they had no arenas of their own. They didn't have any mass spectacles. So these people, all the seats were gone for the most part, which is this huge ring of walls and inside this tumbled mass of ruins. And they interpreted this either as like a grand temple, like the Pantheon, it had a dome over it. It's like a temple of all the gods or a temple of Jupiter, or even as like a home for demons, kind of with a typical superstition where, demons have been summoned, by the magician Virgil, kind of the poet became a magician in the medieval imagination. And so it really, not until the Renaissance, people started reading the texts again closely and linking them to the city of Rome's monuments, was it widely known that the Coliseum had been an arena for fighting for these spectacles. It was soon as just another temple, kind of these grand, mysterious pagan monuments that Middle Ages didn't quite understand.
How did we come to the conclusion that this was an amphitheater for gladiator battles?
I think it was just sort of that the humanists of the 15th and 16th centuries were reading the texts, and they, knew what an amphitheater was for, and publicized that. Learned men, there had been a few who always knew what the Coliseum was, but that had been kind of overshadowed by the popular myth in the Middle Ages. When, the classics became mainstream again in the Renaissance, when it became, almost expected to know good Latin among the elite and to read, at least or pretend to read, a few, your Cicero and your Livy. At that point, there's enough knowledge about the ancient world going around again that people understand what the Coliseum was for. There's no one, kind of eureka moment where we see that, it was an amphitheater. It just kind of became more widespread, this understanding.
And back to the James again, because as we know, they used to flood the Coliseum in the early days for naval battles. Was this, again, I'm using this word a lot in this video episode, but was this a common case, or was it rarely that they flooded to have naval battles inside?
It was very rare. Only by the first few years, the Coliseum's existence. And the reason is that when the Coliseum was first built, it has a very simple hypogeum, kind of underworld. Those passages beneath the Coliseum, there's just kind of a one big passageway, we think, that went beneath it, that was used to float ships up and other things. And so it was easy to flood the Coliseum then. There was an aqueduct right next to it that supplied the imperial palace. And they just turned those waters into the arena, that one single passageway. And you probably fill the whole thing in a couple hours to a depth of, let's say, 1 or 2 meters. And we know they held at least 2 naumachii, naval battles, in the Coliseum. They must have been with miniature ships. It's not a very big arena. It's about the size of like a football field, more or less. Yeah. And so it happened a few times. But they typically did those things. Naumachii, there was a big artificial lake, a stagnum, by the Tiber that was much bigger. It was a better place for those naval battles. So after those first few years, when they staged these battles in the Coliseum, they made a much more elaborate hypogeum, much more of these passageways beneath the arena. And at that point, it was too difficult to pump out those passageways, too time-consuming to do it every time. You couldn't waterproof them. So they decided just to stop doing naumachii in the Coliseum and to do them just in those lakes by the Tiber instead. So they happened in the Coliseum probably only a few times, and before about the mid-80s AD.
And do you have evidence of an aqueduct leading into the Coliseum for this, that is, they did in fact flood the battle, flood the arena, sorry?
Mm-hmm. Well, the best evidence is actually the drainage. So underneath the arena, there are these huge drainage pipes. And they needed drainage, of course, just because there was water flowing down from the seats into those subterranean passageways. But these are far bigger than they would have been for just rainwater. They're these enormous conduits. And so they assume that the size of these big drainage passageways, which go off to a big sewer, leads off to the Tiber then, reflects the need to quickly drain a huge amount of water. The aqueduct connections are also attested. They actually have evidence for water fountains, drinking fountains, in the corridors of the Coliseum, at least in the first years of the building's operation. So it's definitely part of the infrastructure from the beginning. And there's good evidence, we think, for them being able to do both to flood it and drain it pretty quickly during games.
And of course, we have to talk about, I would be trying not to talk about Commodus in this episode, and when he became emperor, and he was really fascinated by the gladiator games. And what made him want to be a gladiator, and how was this looked at by the Senate and everyone around, that he wanted to do gladiator battles himself?
Oh, right. And they were horrified. They couldn't imagine an emperor, the very pinnacle of Roman society, degrading himself to the level of a gladiator, the lowest of the low, the arena fighters. It seems, we don't know his motivations, of course, but there's always this fascination with the gladiators. The emperor had to appear in the arena, win.
Was he the first emperor to do this, or have there been emperors before him doing the same thing?
No, never anyone had appeared in the arena before. Emperors always appeared in the stands. They had that seat, that big seat along, the center of the long end. And they had to make it a showing in the arena. They had to kind of link themselves with the games they were giving for the people. But the idea that they would actually appear on the arena was, beyond, it never occurred to any emperor before Commodus. The movie Gladiator actually does a good job of capturing, kind of this part of the appeal of the arena, that, everyone chants for Maximus. He's the darling of the crowd. And any emperor wanted that kind of adulation. But most of them saw a reason to keep a separation between themselves and the arena itself, to be the guy who gave the games, whose generosity made the games possible, who would pardon the gladiators, but would not himself fight, with those, the criminals and slaves in the arena. But Commodus kind of cut out the middleman and himself went into the arena. And he wasn't like an ordinary run-of-the-mill gladiator. He usually, in the beginning, was more of a beast hunter. He would shoot animals from wooden platforms, He's apparently a very skilled archer. So at one point, he had like 300 bears brought in from all over the empire, and he killed every one of them from a little tower in the middle of the arena. Another time, he had these arrows devised that had these kind of crescent-shaped heads that could decapitate ostriches. And so he brought in a flock of ostriches, from 4,000 miles away, and then decapitated all of them with his arrows, kind of shooting them down, while the senators look on aghast. And so it was, again, it was a way of what he was doing was really what all emperors wanted to do, was perform their power and their generosity before the people. But to do it in this way, to actually become a gladiator himself, was outrageous. The Roman elite couldn't deal with it. And it's part of why he was assassinated. The idea that an emperor would degrade himself in this way meant that he couldn't be a good manager of the empire.
How did the Roman people view that Commodus started? Did they love it that he actually wanted to fight himself, or did it, like you said, disgrace him themselves, the Roman people?
We don't know. Probably he did get some support if he kept doing it. He must have felt that he had the crowd support. All we have really, of course, is the views of the elite who wrote the histories. So like Cassius Dio, who was a senator during Commodus's reign, talks about that ostrich episode. And he actually says that the emperor, decapitated some ostrich and actually held up the bird's head and kind of motioned at the senators like, "You're next, if you cross me." And so they, of course, this is just part of them being terrified of this emperor because, he seems like a threat to everything they do and are. But for the Roman people, the plebs, it may have seemed like kind of an emperor coming down to earth. We don't know. Nero, for example, was popular for the same kind of reason. He never got in the arena, but of course he performed in the theater. And for him, it was this idea, again, of engaging with the people directly, performing for the people, and kind of cutting out the senators and all of the rest of the elite.
And Caligula, when he ran across the ocean on the boats.
Oh, yeah, right. Oh, yeah, Caligula, right. Yeah, that giant boat bridge he built in Baiae. And so, there was clearly this appeal that, an emperor could address the people of Rome directly through the arena. And that was the heart of its appeal. But it didn't work out well for Commodus because, of course, the elite on whom he depended thought this was disgraceful and killed him.
Something I want to ask, did he make dull blades for the gladiators he was fighting against because he was fearing? Is this accurate that he made made the blades that the gladiators were fighting with and turned them into dull blades?
Yeah, supposedly he always fought with dull blades. He never killed anybody in the arena. Because again, it's part of showing his clemency. He wouldn't want to kill anybody in the arena.
No, I mean that the gladiators had dull blades that he was fighting.
In general. Yeah. So fighting against him, they did. And so some emperors actually encouraged there to be fights with just dull blades. They didn't want the carnage in the arena. But typically, actually, the opposite was true because the crowds wanted there to be that element of risk. To make the show thrilling, there had to be the idea that someone could die if everything went wrong. So they actually would ceremonially test the sharpness of the weapons before the fight began. They'd have a guy come out with like a whetstone or something and show how sharp the swords were. So they wanted to know, the crowd in general, that these guys were fighting for their lives. Only the emperors who wanted to emphasize their clemency would have these fights with dull weapons.
What caused the demise of the big gladiator battles? How did it eventually end? Because as we see in the Byzantine Empire, there is the Hyperdome and the races carries on, but gladiator battles kind of stops after a while. What happens here?
Well, it's a blend of things. First, the emperors become Christian, and it becomes harder and harder to justify holding games, or paying for games at least, with the Christian ethical system. There's even a story about a monk who leaps down into the arena and protests, the fight that's going on. And the crowd apparently stoned him to death, supposedly. They didn't want the games to stop. But this gesture supposedly made the emperor Honorius stop the fights. That's probably later legend. It was a combination of that disapproval from Christian elites, of the growing expense of the games. It became harder and harder to get animals, for example. Both because the emperor was weakening and because the animals have been hunted almost to extinction throughout North Africa. So they became more and more expensive to bring to Rome and display. And also because the emperors are no longer in Rome, and they've moved both to Constantinople and other capitals that have no tradition of these arenas. And so they see no reason to kind of start that expense all over again, to kind of reimpose it on themselves. And so a combination of the emperors leaving Rome, of the games becoming more expensive, and of Christianity disapproving of the games leads to their being stopped in the early 4th century, or sorry, early 5th century.
And what happened to the Coliseum after a while? Is it through the barbarians and thieves that caused the Coliseum to collapse the way it did, or was there more than this? Was rot decay had done anything to do with it that they didn't keep it?
Yeah, I mean, it's so the games, so the beast hunts go on a little bit longer than the gladiatorial fights. They're actually held till after the empire collapses. So like Theodoric, the Ostrogothic king of Rome, holds them in the early 6th century. The last games recorded are, I think, in 523. But even at that point, Theodoric has no interest in the games himself. He actually thinks, kind of ironically, that they're barbaric. He actually begins to authorize the stealing of stone from the Coliseum for use in other building projects. It had been damaged by earthquakes repeatedly over the previous centuries, and every time it was repaired a little bit less well. So even by the time the last games were held, half of it was a ruin. That upper deck was already kind of collapsing. And it's kind of colonized after it's abandoned by the emperors or by the kings. People live in the lower arches, but more and more of it collapses after successive earthquakes. And the stone, all that travertine I mentioned, is plundered. It's reused for churches. It's burned to make lime for mortar. And finally, there's a really big earthquake in the 14th century, which causes the entire south half of the building to collapse. That's why it looks so lopsided today. And that huge amount of stone formed by that collapse builds half the churches of Renaissance Rome. You find it in St. Peter's, for example, a couple of bridges over the Tiber. And the pillage goes on for centuries till it's finally stopped in the 1700s by one of the popes. And so it's really a combination of those earthquakes and that constant pillaging of easy to take, ready shaped travertine that makes the Coliseum into the ruin we see it today.
And I think basically it covered basically of what it was really like. Do you have any other misconceptions about being a gladiator, or have you done through most of it?
I'd say one more thing, and that's like I mentioned in the beginning, kind of the idea that all the games are a bloodbath. Just emphasize that probably about 1 in 5 gladiators died. In a given match. So 1 in 5 matches ended in death. That, of course, aren't great odds, if you're a gladiator, but doesn't mean that someone died every single time. So, again, I'd say that the big misconception is that it's not just about killing people. It's about the artistry of the fight and kind of this risk. The idea that the person who loses can lose his life. You're fighting for the ultimate stakes. And that's what gives the games their allure, in the Roman eyes.
Actually, something that I forgot to ask about is how often did a gladiator, and was it true that a gladiator could gain freedom by the emperor? And how often did this happen?
It did. It did happen. We don't know how often, but we have record of it happening several times. So typically a gladiator gets his freedom after, let's say, 5 or 6 years of fighting. Let's say he's fought maybe 12, 15 times at that point. If you win that many fights, either your contract with your school's manager comes due, or you're given your freedom formally by that school's the director of your school, the Lanista, or if you fought something really spectacular in the Coliseum, by the emperor himself. So the emperor, we have a number of emperors. The crowd will acclaim kind of spontaneously sometimes to give freedom to someone who's fought really, really well, and then the emperor, if he's smart, will listen to them and kind of again show how he's his clemency and his mercy and his concern with the people of Rome. So it definitely happened. We don't know how often that kind of spectacular clemency happened, but it did occur.
And of course, I have to ask, what did you think of the Gladiator as a movie? Both as a movie and a historic accuracy.
I think it's a great movie, which has almost no historical basis. And so again, sometimes as a historian, you just enjoy a movie as a movie. And so they got a lot of this kind of incidental detail right. They kind of get the city of Rome itself looks, I think, very impressive, very like Rome must have looked. The Coliseum, I think, appears that they capture the atmosphere of the Coliseum very well. And they also capture kind of, I think, the atmosphere of gladiatorial schools. But of course, Maximus never existed. And Commodus, who was real, was nothing like, Joaquin Phoenix's character in the movie. He ruled for, almost 13 years, just like a single year. And he did indeed hate the Senate, as the character in the movie did. but it didn't not in the same way. It also wasn't incestuous and all other things. So I think that
I think we actually talked about this in the episode 304, where we talked about ancient Rome, that he should have been younger as well.
Yes, yeah, he probably should have. Well, he was probably about in his early 20s when he became emperor. So he wasn't too far off, but yeah, younger than the actor was. And so yeah, I would say that it captures the atmosphere of Rome very well. It's a good movie in its own right, but historically speaking, it's not. It's just a movie. Nothing to do with what actually happened.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Before you go, do you have anything you wish to promote on the social media where people might find you?
Yes. So I have my YouTube channel, Told in Stone, which if you enjoy ancient history, you hopefully enjoy a lot of great stuff about the city of Rome itself.
I would highly recommend it because it's really...
Thank you. And I actually just wrote a book, which is coming out next week. Called Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants, Frequently Asked Questions about the Ancient Greeks and Romans. And it answers 36 frequently asked questions about the ancient world, ranging some about the gladiators in the Coliseum, actually. And I think, again, that if you're a history buff, you'd enjoy that book.
I definitely will look for it when it comes out.
Thank you.
And my name is Erlend. This has been Will That Age Well. We are available on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. And we are on social media on Instagram, Well That Aged Well. And next week, we'll talk about Nicephorus III, the road and of the Byzantine Empire. Now, my name is Erlend, and this has been Will That Aged Well. Oh, by the way, before we go, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast, and I'll see you next time.